No human system is perfect.
The future destinies of the empire.
By the courage and the determination of our people.
The oceans of the world have been swept clear.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be.
He strove that there should not be a division between East and West.
The meeting of the NATO powers is an important development.
And it will need our courage and our strength.
Because we are engaged, as you know, on a field.
But that revolution cannot become a reality unless we are prepared to make far-reaching changes.
I shall announce to Parliament the measures which we judge necessary in this present situation.
And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
In short, it is time to put up or shut up.
My three main priorities for government: education, education, and education.
We find ourselves in a position unknown to this generation of political leaders.
And starting with Nick Clegg as Deputy Prime Minister, Liberal Democrats will be represented at every level.
To have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home. Stay at home.
Hello, I'm Ian Dale and welcome to The Prime Ministers, a series of 55 podcasts on the 55 British Prime Ministers who've held the office in the 300 years since Sir Robert Walpole came to power in April 1721. In this series, I talk to the authors of the 55 essays in my book, The Prime Ministers. Each week, you'll hear about a different Prime Minister from Walpole to Johnson. And if you want to hear more, as opposed to read more, you can download the audiobook from Audible. This week I'm speaking to Lord Adonis, Andrew Adonis, about the life and premiership of Tony Blair. And of course Tony Blair was Prime Minister for 10 years between 1997 and 2007. Now I think, Andrew, you're almost unique in the authors in my book of having actually worked for the person that you're writing about. Just explain your relationship with Tony Blair over the years.
I first met Tony Blair when I was a journalist on the FT, when I spotted that he was an absolute superstar politically, and we spent a lot of time talking about politics in the late 80s and early 90s, and that was before he even became Shadow Home Secretary, but he was clearly the up-and-coming thing, super charismatic, dynamic, and so on. I was then a Liberal Democrat, and he, of course, was Labour, but we shared a complete identity of view on what needed to happen to the centre-left. Indeed, I vividly remember after the 1992 election, he came into the FT in quite a depressed state because Labour had just lost the election, saying he was thinking of leaving politics because he thought things were so bad, and that if John Major could win with a 6-point lead, then in what circumstances were Labour ever going to win an election? And he took us through all the things that needed to change if Labour was going to get elected. It needed to become the party of aspiration. It needed to separate itself from ideas of mass nationalisation, high taxation. It needed to be the patriotic party. It needed to be tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, the whole lot. And I remember him looking at me as he finished all this, saying, do you think that will do? Will that win? And I said, no, I don't think that's good enough, Tony. He said, well, what's the problem? I said, it's the name. I said, I don't think a party called Labour can now get elected in southern England. It's just too retro, too old, too associated with things that people in southern England don't associate with. And he said, well, what do you suggest? And I said, well, how about Liberal Democrat? And he said, ha, ha, ha. Anyway, he then went on to the stratosphere, Shadow Home Secretary, and of course John Smith died 2 years later. And we had a deal that if he made it, I'd go and work for him. And you don't say no to Prime Minister, so I ended up working for him.
Even though he knew that your politics were, well, I was going to say different, but of course...
Oh, no, they weren't different. No, Tony is a social liberal. I'm a social liberal. There's no...
So am I.
Yes. Well, maybe there's no maybe there's no ideological difference between the three of us. I have if I can hesitate, I think to suggest that maybe there's a bit more social about Tony and me than you in terms of our liberalism. But it may not be true. Maybe we're all in the same party. However, when he abolished Clause 4, because I didn't join the Labour Party when he first became leader in 1994, I said I thought there was still a problem with the party. I said that to him directly at the time. And he then proceeded, of course, to do two things: to change the party's constitution so that the Clause 4 commitment to mass nationalisation was given up, which for me was a real obstacle, because I don't believe in a party where the state has is a controlling force in the economy. And he then changed the name, of course, to New Labour, and at that point I joined.
I thought you were going to say in that famous meeting that you had come up with the name New Labour, but
no, I don't know. Well, I don't know who came up with the name. I think it was Philip Gould. Philip Gould was a very big influence on Tony, now sadly died. And Philip was endlessly focus grouping. 2 or 3 times a week he'd be meeting 20 voters in Watford or in suburban Birmingham. He really did. He himself, of course, was from Guildford. I think he was a Southern England provincial boy, and he really did understand what the English provinces were thinking. And Sierra man, Worcester woman, this archetype which New Labour people had of Middle England voters, typically provincial, typically suburban. This was a very, very good litmus test of Labour policy and branding, because of course they are the swing voters in elections, and most parliamentary seats, as you and I know who've seen this over a long time, most parliamentary seats are in suburban and provincial England, and the party which wins suburban and provincial England wins the election, and Tony Blair was always well aware of that.
And in 1996 I did own a Ford Sierra, but
did you?
I didn't succumb to his blandishments.
Well, you didn't move to Worcester, Ian, and this is maybe the reason why you stayed in the Tory party.
Coming from Essex. Let's look at his background, his childhood, his education, because I think it's quite an interesting story to tell there, because I mean, he had a bit of a Tory upbringing, didn't he?
Well, his dad was a would-be Tory MP. Yeah. Though his dad was very interesting, because his dad started off as a youthful communist and then became more and more establishment as he got older, particularly after he became a law lecturer. He became a law lecturer in Durham University, and from then on became increasingly conservative. And if he hadn't had a stroke when Tony was in his early teens, he probably would have become a Conservative MP. He'd done the rounds of selection meetings and so on. 2 things happened that were transformational in Tony's life: his father having a stroke and his mother dying also when he was a teenager. At 21, just as he was graduating from Oxford, his mother died. I think that was very important in terms of fixing his ambition and realising the need to get on fast. One of my rules of politics, from like you being a long observer of it, is that most people, not all people, but most people who reach the top, have started in elective office by the age of 30. Tony is elected to the House of Commons at the age of 30 precisely, and he fights a by-election at the age of 29. He develops a passion to go into the House of Commons in his mid-20s. So though it's true to say, people often say he wasn't political at university, that's true, but he became political quite soon afterwards, is determined to become an MP. He gets a lot of the ambition, I think, from his father. It is a family, or almost a genetic thing. And when he becomes a barrister, he goes to work in the chambers of Lord Irvine, Derry Irvine, who of course is highly political and was very close to John Smith. They've been at university together. And that's what gets him his entree into Labour politics too. Now, if Tony hadn't, he only gets the nomination in Sedgefield in County Durham, partly because of it. He is brought up in Durham, so even though in many ways he's very elite, he does have County Durham Labour connections. He gets the nomination as the last selection before the 1983 election, after the election has been called, when the MP stands down, by 1 vote. So, I mean, you talk about close-run things in politics. That's about as close-run as it can be. It's arguable that Margaret Thatcher was closer, in that Charles Moore, in his biography of Margaret Thatcher, argues that, suggests from evidence, that Thatcher didn't even win the selection in Finchley. It was fixed by the constituency chairman, who swapped to vote because he was so keen on her getting the nomination, and she had lost it by 1 vote. So these are very fine margins. But for my knowledge of Tony and his temperament, I think if he hadn't got elected at the age of 30, he might never have stood again for Parliament. Because I think he might have made his way in the law as a professional. And
of course, by that time, he'd also met Cherie at Derry Irvine's chambers. And they also had some sort of pact about the first one to get selected or elected would be the one that would go forward. And she nearly did, didn't she?
She certainly was more political in her early 20s. She was much more Labour at that stage. She came from a Liverpool Labour family and had a very, very clear sense of where she wanted to go politically. And both she and Tony ended up in Derry Irvine's set. And both of them were determined to become Labour MPs. And both of them stood in the 1983 general election. Tony stood with the last-minute selection in County Durham, and she stood in Thanet in the southeast. She lost, he won, and the rest is history.
The rest is history, indeed. So He got elected in June 1983, obviously massive Thatcher landslide, then I think 144 majority. Michael Foot was leader of the Labour Party, and he had actually been quite impressed by Tony Blair, hadn't he, in the Beaconsfield by-election?
Michael Foot had developed a great fondness for Tony, which indeed lasted to the end. I remember very shortly before Michael died, I went to interview him actually about Roy Jenkins, whose biography I was writing, and Michael was very, very strongly in favour of the military intervention in Kosovo. He saw it as a matter of fundamental human rights. And he never turned against Tony in the way that many on the left did. He was hugely relieved that Tony was the candidate in the Beaconsfield by-election, because he'd had horrors to deal with in terms of militants and the left all the way in the run-up to the 1983 election. And Tony tells a very great story of Michael turning up when he's campaigning in the Beaconsfield by-election, being pleasantly surprised that he's got this thoroughly user-friendly Labour candidate. And after an hour of perfunctory canvassing, because there weren't many Labour voters in Beaconsfield, and a press conference, they head off to the pub where they talk about P.G. Wodehouse and have a great literary conversation. And that was very important, actually, because Michael strongly supported Tony for the nomination for Sedgefield in 1983, and a letter was circulated of support from Michael Foot, which I think may have been decisive to him winning the nomination.
Because in many ways you can't imagine two people more sort of streets apart in terms of their politics. With Michael Foot, CND, wanted to come out of the European Economic Community as it was then, and that you have Tony Blair, very pro-European, clearly not somebody who would give much time to CND, although I think he did have to say a few things in their favour in the election campaign.
Do you know, I'm not so sure about that. I used to think that way, but as I become older, I think politics is a lot more about psychology and a lot less about policy. Michael's the son of a Liberal. His father was a very long-standing West Country Liberal, and indeed his brothers remained Liberal, and he was Oxford as well. And I think he saw a kind of soulmate in Tony. And of course, at that stage, Tony was subscribing to all of the left-wing policies. He didn't have a problem then, publicly at any rate, and he wasn't expressing much problem in private with leaving the European Union. And of course, he was then famously, though it was denied later, but it is true, he was a member of CND then. It was very hard to get selected as a Labour candidate if you weren't a member of CND in 1983. It's a bit like, you have to be a Brexiter if you're a Tory now. And I know plenty of Tories. You know plenty of them too.
That's not true, but that's the subject for another podcast. Yeah.
But the point about it is he did go along with the orthodoxy, and that's what enabled Michael Foot to support him and enabled him to become a candidate at the age of 30.
And how quickly was he talent spotted in amongst this grouping of new Labour MPs at the time? Because there were quite a few that were, I remember working in Parliament in the mid-1980s for a couple of years, and there were quite a few in that 83 intake that were quite impressive.
Well, the two who stood out from day one were Gordon Brown and Tony Blair because of their youth and charisma. Gordon was 3 years older than Tony, but they were clearly the new generation, clearly super intelligent and very articulate. At the time, Gordon was the politically more articulate, but from the beginning, Tony was the more televisual, and in many ways the one who was more compelling to an English audience. And it's a very striking thing that no Labour leader has become Prime Minister who isn't English. And I think that's very important to understand. There have been plenty of Scots and Welsh who become leader of the Labour Party. None of them has won an overall majority. There's Ramsay MacDonald, but he never won an overall majority. The three who've won overall majorities, Attlee, Wilson and Blair, have all been English, and being English has been vitally important because taking on the Tories, who are quintessentially an English national party, it's very hard to do so unless you've got really strong support in England. So from the outset, Tony was clearly very strong. He was talent spotted very early. He went on the front bench barely a year after getting elected as a shadow Treasury spokesman in Deputy Leader Roy Hattersley's shadow Treasury team. And then shortly after the 1987 election, he got himself elected to the Shadow Cabinet, was Shadow Energy Secretary, and then Shadow Employment Secretary. And in that role, in the run-up to the 1992 election, he was a pivotal figure because what he successfully did, which is what marked him out as a leader of some bravery, was he ditched the closed shop and managed to strike a new position on what had been the most toxic issue for Labour in the 1970s and 80s, which was unconstrained union power. Tony understood that. He was very clear that Labour wouldn't win another election until Middle England trusted Labour not to be wholly in the pockets of the unions. They didn't mind a party that was in favour of social justice, but they absolutely didn't want people like Arthur Scargill telling a Labour Prime Minister how to run the country. And what Tony did in divorcing Labour from the closed shop, which was the most egregious example of overweening union power, was hugely significant. And I think in many ways that's what ultimately made him leader, because it was his courage as well as his charisma that I think was fundamental to him becoming leader and Prime Minister.
Well, let's look at that, because obviously we all remember that day in May 1994 when John Smith died. And I remember that day, obviously, sort of as an observer, but thinking to myself, well, they would be mad not to go for Tony Blair to succeed John Smith. And clearly the party came to the same conclusion. But that was the start of the so-called TBGBs, wasn't it, where Gordon Brown sort of festered for the next decade or more, thinking it should have been him. And you can understand why in many ways, because he was, in political terms, in policy terms, he was the senior of the two, even though they were elected at the same time.
But I'm not sure that he was either politically or in policy terms the senior of the two by 1994. In the late 80s and early 90s, he clearly was. But by 1994, he developed a much more compelling political narrative than Gordon Brown. I mean, just the two slogans say it all: tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, and education, education, education. You know, he really did understand where Middle England was. And he was much more centrist in his appeal as well. And as I said earlier, much more English in his appeal. And it's very telling, of course, that Gordon didn't stand against him in the 1994 election. And Gordon, who I know well, I served in his cabinet after Tony stood down in 1997. Gordon is quite possibly the most politically ambitious person I've ever met in my life. I mean, Boris Johnson is up there too, actually. Boris is much more politically ambitious than he seems. Maybe the two are on a par, actually. Both of them basically wanted to be Prime Minister from the time they were at university, which certainly isn't true of Tony. And if Gordon had thought he could win, or even get close to winning, in 1994, he would have stood against Tony. But all the polling and all of the soundings that were taken amongst Labour MPs who were absolutely desperate to win an election after having lost 4 elections was clear that Tony Blair was the one who could win and the one who would therefore win the Labour leadership. And that's why Gordon didn't stand. So what happened, as often takes place in politics, was a myth was developed. The myth was that Gordon generously stood down in favour of Tony. That isn't what happened at all. What happened was about 10 days of really high-level tension, with Gordon very much in the running and Peter Mandelson, in a sense, arbitrating almost between the two and not declaring his hand because he was trying to see that there wasn't open warfare between the two of them. And it was only when it was clear that it would be Tony that that Gordon stood down. And the same was actually true in the following over the following 10 years. Because
do you think there was a deal between them?
Well, there certainly wasn't a contract. There was nothing written. Did Tony say to Gordon, look, I'm not intending to go on and on? Yes. Did he say, I will definitely stand down after 10 years as leader? Very disputed. My reading of the situation is he didn't say it in such categoric terms, but he certainly led Gordon to believe he wouldn't fight a third election, and he did ultimately decide he would fight that third election.
Now, he immediately appointed some really powerful people around him, Alistair Campbell being one, Jonathan Powell. And although I think at the beginning the shadow cabinets were elected, weren't they?
Yes.
Obviously, once he got into government, he went through the motions initially, but he a bit like Attlee in 1945, he wasn't afraid of big beasts in his cabinet.
He was never afraid of big beasts. Indeed, it's very important to understand that though he and Gordon had really difficult relations pretty well from the beginning, much more difficult than people realised at the time, he never sacked Gordon. He stuck with him all the way through the 10 years. And ultimately, of course, he handed over to him in an uncontested election in 2007. And I think a good part of the reason for that was his understanding that politics, successful politics, really successful, high-level winning politics, is about presenting teams of winners and big beasts. And I remember him saying to me once, the electorate don't pay that much attention to politics, but every few years they check that everything's okay. And every election they looked up and they saw Blair, Brown, Prescott, and they thought, that's fine. And with good reason, because Gordon was a successful chancellor. He was a difficult man, but a very successful chancellor. He was rock solid. And this Blair-Brown combination, not only was it strong in policy and governmental terms, but the country saw it and was reassured. And having that same combination 3 elections running was hugely important. It's my view that if it had gone into a 4th election, though in personality terms it may just not have been possible to sustain it for a 4th election, but had it gone into a 4th election, I think it might have won a 4th election too.
We've spent 25 minutes talking about his pre-Prime Minister career. Let's move on. Let's split it into 2. Let's start with domestic politics, because that's where most votes are, I think. You can occasionally gain votes by winning a war, that sort of thing, or you can lose votes by maybe losing a war or even fighting a war. So we'll come on to all of that a little bit later. But in terms of domestic politics, he's admitted in his first term that he wasn't daring enough, not radical enough. Is that a judgment you share?
I don't actually share it, because the government was very radical in its first term. It largely rewrote the British Constitution. Devolution to Scotland and Wales, the Mayor of London, removing the hereditary peers from the House of Lords. These were very, very big changes, and the Scottish one in particular might come to look like a seismic change. And of course, he also sealed the deal in Northern Ireland. Now, I don't think John Major gets enough credit for starting the Northern Ireland peace process, but it's certainly true that Tony Blair deserves huge credit for finishing it with the Good Friday Agreement. Now, he was very, very closely engaged in the Good Friday Agreement and those Northern Ireland negotiations. And as he looks back, he clearly sees that as a major triumph of his first term. But of course, without him, none of those other constitutional reforms would have been carried. And though he personally wasn't particularly emotionally engaged in them, they nonetheless were only carried because he was Prime Minister, and they were big changes. There was also the minimum wage in the first term. And the other thing that was crucially important in the first term, which I don't think he understands sufficiently, was he just took it for granted in his second and third terms, is economic stability and Labour being trusted on the economy. Roy Jenkins used to tell me the problem with Labour governments is they spend their first half term getting into an economic mess and their second half term trying to dig themselves out of it, usually unsuccessfully. What Labour under Tony Blair does...
Actually, if you look back in history, he's absolutely right, isn't he? If you go back to sort of Wilson, to Attlee, to Ramsay MacDonald,
always
absolutely
true.
Right.
Always true. And indeed, just to extend the metaphor, he said usually by changing chancellors, he said, except with Dennis Healey, who served under both Wilson and Callaghan in the 1970s, who was an India rubber figure who did both the destruction and the construction afterwards. So he had a very good line on these things. However, Tony learnt from that. And in what was a very unpopular move in the Labour Party, he stuck with Ken Clarke, the Tory outgoing chancellor in 1997. He stuck with his spending plans, which meant there wasn't a big spending increase in the first 3 years of the Labour government. I remember I was spending all my time with Labour MPs being told I was a Tory because we wouldn't spend anything. But once we had...
And you were working in Downing Street
I was working
at that point,
from 1998, I was working for Tony. But what happened was, having established that bedrock of economic competence, which was so important, at that point, Gordon did start significantly increasing public spending, particularly on health. Health spending trebles in real terms.
But that was actually triggered by Tony Blair, wasn't it? When he went on the David Frost show. I think it was David Frost.
It's called David Frost. We now call it Mar, don't we? But it was that programme. Yeah. And he announced it, because this leads to Gordon phoning him afterwards in a great state, saying, you've fucking done my budget or spent my budget or something. But the key point about it is he was able to do that by then because Labour wasn't in a state of massive public distrust on the economy. So much so that in the 2001 and 2005 elections, amazingly, Blair and Brown are able to use investment against cuts. It was always investment, not spending, investment against cuts, as a dividing line with the Conservatives. And it was partly because he'd established this bedrock of economic competence after 1997. It was partly because the economy was growing, though you always have to give credit to a government for an economy growing. People say, oh, they were lucky the economy grew. economies don't just grow by chance. The productive parts of the economy were very reassured by New Labour. They didn't see it as a threat. They saw it, actually, many of them, as a continuation of the best of Thatcherism in terms of the economic fundamentals. And most of them agreed that we needed a new deal on the public services, which Thatcher had neglected. And that was the third bit that was important. What marked out Tony's public spending is that he particularly focused it on public services, which were both working class and middle class. It was the working class and the middle class together who got the big benefits of trebling real-term spending on health and doubling real-term spending on education. Whereas the traditional Labour Association, just with pouring money into welfare, even though this did have cross-class effects, was always seen as much more an agenda just for the working class. So Tony was very skillful in the way he handled the economy and actually persuaded Middle England, his Worcester woman and Sierra man, to accept much higher levels of public spending and taxation than I think would have been possible under an alternative leader.
I've never worked out whether this story is apocryphal or not, but Margaret Thatcher was said to regard Tony Blair as her greatest legacy, because there was a feeling in the late 1980s that the Labour Party was finished, that it could never win an election again. But I think she did say at some point that she felt the country was safe in his hands.
Well, she famously said when she met him, "You and I have destroyed socialism." Now, of course, what is socialism is a great question. If socialism is a more communitarian view of politics and higher levels of public spending, then Tony was a socialist. What he emphatically was not, though, was he was not in favour of mass public ownership, which was a big departure from old Labour, and he wanted a new deal with the trade unions. So what's the truth? He was a social democrat in the Roy Jenkins mode, actually. And I think that's what made him so successful, because the English middle class has always been quite keen on social democracy, but not at all keen on Marxist-style socialism.
Let's talk about Europe, but in a domestic way, first of all, because one of the sliding doors moments, I think, on our relationship with the European Union, as it then was, or then became, was whether we should join the euro or not. And with a majority of 179, I've always thought that Tony Blair could have done exactly what he wanted. He would have been able to do it and get away with it and still win the next election. Now, he wanted to do it. His Chancellor didn't. I've often wondered how things would have been different in all of our politics had his will prevailed at that time.
Well, I don't see it like that from the historical record which I've looked at. Tony didn't move to go into the euro in the first term, and I don't think he would have done but for Gordon either. The reason he didn't was he wasn't convinced that he could win a referendum on it. In his bones, he wasn't convinced he could, and he didn't want a big battle with Rupert Murdoch, which there would have been, because the sort of unspoken deal he had with Murdoch was that the Murdoch papers would support Blair, which they did, the Times and the Sun, particularly the Sun, which was then thought to be hugely important, 3 million readers and all of that, supported Labour in the 1997
5
election.
million at that point, I think.
Sorry?
3 million sales, 5 million readers.
5 million readers,
at that
yes,
point,
absolutely right, 3 million sales. They wouldn't have supported him if he'd proposed to go into the euro. And the decision to rule out an early joining of the euro, your scenario immediately post 1997 when he would have had to have done it, was taken very soon after Tony became leader, and it was taken by Tony and Gordon together. It wasn't just Gordon. What Tony thought actually was that he might be able to do it in the second term once he'd really established himself. Now, I agree with you. I think electorally and politically he could only have done it in the first term. It is true in the second term he and Gordon had a big disagreement about it. In the second term he did want to move towards it, and Gordon didn't. By the second term, though, I think it was too late to be able to carry it politically. I don't think you could have won a referendum. And also, significantly, Tony actually reached the same conclusion. He doesn't move immediately in the second term to try and join the euro. What he does, and his big argument with Gordon, is he doesn't want to rule it out. What Gordon wants to do, partly because Gordon, of course, is thinking of the succession and doesn't want to be, as he sees it, lumbered with a potential euro commitment, is Gordon essentially wants to rule out the euro, whereas Tony wants to keep it open, hoping that there may come a new situation where he might be able to go in. But Tony does not move on the euro immediately after the 2001 election, which was the only outside chance he had after not moving after 1997 to have gone in.
You've mentioned having a referendum on it a couple of times there. Of course, there would have been precedent for not having a referendum at all.
But he'd announced before 1997 that he would have a referendum, and that was taken at the time, and I think in retrospect correctly, as meaning he wasn't going to do it, because you're completely correct. If he was determined to do the euro, he would have made the 1997 election itself the mandate for going straight in to the single currency after. He didn't do that. He gave a categoric commitment in the 1997 Labour manifesto.
That was a mistake? I mean, if he had known that the size of majority was going to be 179 and somebody somewhere, Philip Gould or whoever, had calculated, well, if you promise that you're going to go into the euro without a referendum, that 179 will come down to 129 or 89 or whatever, assuming it was still a decent-sized majority. If he'd known that at the time, do you think he would have done that?
I think he probably would have done, is the answer. But he thought, partly because of all the experience of the 80s and early 90s, that it was just impossible for Labour to win a big majority. Until it actually happened, he thought it was impossible. And he used to tell people all the time, and he believed it, to ignore the polls. This is England. There's always massive swings to the Tories. John Major is a decent centrist. He might be weak, which is a problem for him, but is certainly not extreme. Until it actually happened, he didn't think it was possible to win a big majority. And that's part of the reason why he spent so much time cultivating the Liberal Democrats and Paddy Ashdown as well. He thought that he might need a coalition, either an actual coalition because Labour didn't have a majority on its own, or a virtual coalition because the majority was so small.
That's a really interesting point, actually, because if you read Paddy Ashdown's diaries, which I think are phenomenally interesting, the level of discussion on all sorts of different policy areas and electoral reform and all the rest of it, it was almost a done deal that there would be a coalition with the Liberal Democrats having seats in the cabinet.
That's absolutely correct. And that was all on the basis that there either wouldn't be a Labour majority or a small Labour majority. I think, to be fair, by 1997, Tony was convinced that he would win. Everyone around him thought that Labour was going to win by then, but they didn't think that he'd win by a huge majority.
I think he felt a bit bad about all of that, didn't he? As if he'd kind of let Paddy Ashdown down.
Well, it was a difficult situation because the truth is, once Labour had a majority of 179, you couldn't possibly justify a coalition because it would have looked like abolishing the opposition. It's important now because we all now think, of course, that the normal state of affairs once again has become the Tories winning. After 1997, when, what is it, half of the cabinet lose their seats? Portillo, were you up for Portillo and all of that? After that happens in 1997, people are genuinely worried that we might be becoming a one-party state. And a Lab-Lib coalition, which only had, William Hague's Conservative Party with whatever it was, 160 seats in the House of Commons in the opposition, looked almost like a takeover of the opposition as well as the government. Now, that is hilarious, seen from the vantage point of 2021, but it was a very real concern in 1997.
Social legislation, civil partnerships, I guess, is the one thing that everybody points to as a real achievement under the Blair government. Anything else that you can point to on sort of social? The
minimum wage. When one looks back at this government, sees what the two really progressive things it did. It was a new deal for the working poor, and it was the minimum wage plus tax credits. Now, tax credits haven't stood the test of time, and George Osborne largely abolished them. But the minimum wage has stuck, and indeed it's become an international trend towards much higher minimum wages, and that has helped the working poor significantly. And as you say, civil partnerships, which of course paved the way then for equal marriage. And Tony was very progressive on both. He with a very fine understanding of Middle England again, and again being prepared to lead, he could see how you could put together popular majorities for both. He understood that Middle England was perfectly willing to see a new deal for the poor, providing people who could work did work, and that Middle England wasn't prejudiced. And so he moved decisively on both of those, even though there were they were quite significant battles with the Conservatives at the time on both of those.
And also the whole antisocial behaviour agenda, the Labour tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime agenda, that was, I think, possibly the most crucial thing that he did to attract soft Tory support, that people felt safe with him. I can remember on election night in 1997, or in the morning, driving along the embankment and hearing all of this sound coming from New Festival, and I stopped my car and wound down the window. And I'd said to my partner, I said, I think we can be safe with him. And at that point, I would have been a self-described radical right-wing Thatcherite, but I didn't feel what I felt about Neil Kinnock, that I thought Neil Kinnock would be a disaster and an embarrassment as Prime Minister, but Tony Blair wouldn't.
What Philip Gould said to Tony early on in his leadership was that what Middle England needed was reassurance, that they liked Tony Blair, they looked at him and they liked him. They did support new investment in public services. Part of the reason why Labour and the left become more popular in the 1990s is a sense that the good side of Thatcherism was putting the economy right, but the bad side was the neglect of the public services, education, health and the public sphere. But they wanted reassurance on the unions and on crime. Those were the two big issues. Actually, thirdly, that taxes weren't going to go through the roof. They needed reassurance that Labour was going to manage the economy successfully. And Tony Blair, though in retrospect I think is surprisingly bold in some areas as Prime Minister. We haven't yet come to the international sphere, but of course he was boldest of all there. He was also immensely reassuring for Conservative Middle England, and that's why he was able, uniquely for a Labour leader, to win 3 elections in a row.
Well, let's turn to international affairs. Now, he had no experience of international diplomacy. Frankly, most prime ministers don't, do they, when they first get into office? And I wonder whether you think that he was typical of many prime ministers who become obsessed by international affairs in their second term, and they concentrate on that sometimes to the exclusion of the domestic agenda. Do you think that he could be accused of that?
I wouldn't say obsessed, though it certainly is true that after 9/11 and what was seen as the international war on terrorism, it becomes the single most important thing he does. Whereas in the first term, the single most important thing he does in the first term in terms of time is Northern Ireland. Typically, when you're waiting outside what was called the Den, his office in Downing Street, in the first term, you'd be told it's Northern Ireland going on in there. Typically, in the second term, it was Iraq and the war on terror before Iraq going on. But he never neglected international affairs in the first term. He was very involved in what was going on in the Balkans and Milosevic, taking on Milosevic towards the end of the first term. And he persuaded Bill Clinton in what was, I think, a very dramatic moment of his premiership to send ground forces into Kosovo and to agree to...
even today, he's treated as a hero in Kosovo.
He is. Well, apparently the most common name in Kosovo is Tony Blair. He's still regarded as a hero there. He did a similar intervention in Sierra Leone. And actually, those are very important, because when people say, well, didn't Iraq come out of the blue and suddenly he becomes in favour of intervention abroad? That's not correct. This escalates during his first term and into his second term. And the first 3 interventions were seen to be necessary and successful. Kosovo and Sierra Leone in the first term, and then Afghanistan after 9/11 at the beginning of the second term. Now, taking the long view, Afghanistan wasn't successful, but there was an international coalition and a UN resolution behind Afghanistan, and it was seen as absolutely unavoidable at the beginning of the second term. And so when George Bush decides he's moving on Iraq, Tony has form in international intervention by then, and it then does become the most important thing he does. But he never gives up on domestic reform, and there's a team, including myself, who are busy pushing his domestic agenda right through to the end in 2007. He does understand that he's not going to win, because he wins his third election in 2005 after the Iraq War, and he wins it decisively. He understands he's not going to win if he's seen to have neglected the home front.
Most prime ministers are remembered for one thing by future historians, and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Do you think it's inevitable that in 100 years' time that one thing will be Iraq, or do you think that historians might be kinder to him than some of his contemporaries are?
I think perspective always changes judgments, and the perspective is already changing on Tony Blair. It's quite fascinating to watch as his biographer, so I'm watching this closely. A few years ago, it was clearly Iraq was the legacy. After Labour has lost another 4 elections, which is the situation now in 2021, and Tony Blair has shown himself to be by far the most effective leader on all of the COVID issues and with a compelling public narrative. I'm very struck that there's quite a large constituency out there that harks back to the glory days of Blair, the election winner, who was also good at running the country. And if ultimately Ireland comes back in the frame again as an issue, and never underestimate the capacity of Ireland to become a very, very difficult issue. It's already starting to in some respects with Brexit. Then the peace process looms large too. So the only thing I can see clearly is that there are three big pieces of the jigsaw in respect of Tony Blair, which are incontrovertible. There's the Iraq intervention, which was massive. There was winning 3 elections and getting public support for a social democratic agenda. That was massive. And there was peace in Northern Ireland, and that was massive. What the balance between those 3 will be in judgments, I think, will depend very much on what the public preoccupations are at any given time.
He was clearly determined to maintain the relationship with Clinton and then Bush as a sort of transatlantic partnership. Do you think that in retrospect he went too far down that road with George W. Bush?
I do personally, but in terms of explaining what he was doing, his view was that it was very, very hard in security terms and geopolitical terms for a British Prime Minister to divorce themselves from a US president. Now, actually, as a matter of historical judgment, I'm not sure that's correct. I think it may well be that Harold Wilson's best single policy judgment was not to go into Vietnam with LBJ. And that was a very similar case of a US president who was absolutely determined, for reasons which were very much rooted in American politics, anti-communism and all of that, to do something which, in the judgment of most world leaders, was pretty foolhardy. I think actually the Iraq situation was quite similar, but that wasn't Tony's view. Tony's view was that the security of the country, as well as the electability of the Labour Party, depended upon being very close to a US president. And he also formed the judgment that in respect of what was going on in Iraq and the Middle East, that an intervention in Iraq justified by weapons of mass destruction could also be successful in bringing stability to the Middle East. Well, whatever one thinks of the justification in terms of WMD, the one thing that the Iraq intervention didn't bring at the time and hasn't brought in retrospect either is stability. So it was a fateful judgment. It's explicable by the weapons of mass destruction belief, which was deeply held at the time, that he was a real and present danger, plus sticking close to George W. Bush. But it was clearly a very controversial decision that he took.
Do you think we've talked a lot about things that he got right? We haven't talked too much about what he got wrong so far. Let me put one thing to you: immigration, which a lot of people think what happened in, 2003, 2004, with the mass immigration from Eastern Europe into this country, that was what really sparked what happened, 12 years later with the Brexit referendum. It could have been done differently. Other countries did it differently to us. Is that something that you think in retrospect they should have done what other European countries did and said, well, no, we're not going to allow this level of immigration right from the start?
Yes, I do. I entirely agree with you. The great irony of what happens on immigration from Central and Eastern Europe after 2003, because, as you say, what happens is when the Central East European, the big Central East European countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, Hungary, when they come into the European Union, Britain does not impose the 7-year transitional controls on freedom of movement, which the rest of the EU, or almost all of the rest of the EU, impose. The great irony of it, though, as I look back on it, is that it wasn't a case of too much Europe, it was a case of too little Europe. If we had simply done what the rest of Europe did and didn't opt out, I think we would have been okay. If we'd done the same 7-year transitional controls as Germany and France in particular, which of course are the two other large EU countries, and so the immigrant move across Europe, which was bound to happen from poorer countries to richer countries, was spread more evenly, I think you're right. It may be that you wouldn't have got over 50% in that 2016 referendum. The great irony is that this opt-out culture, that everything that the EU does, the best British policy is to negotiate an opt-out and to do it differently, which goes right back to the exchange rate mechanism in the 1970s. The first thing which the first government, after we go into the EU, Jim Callaghan's government, does in the 1970s is not to go into the exchange rate mechanism. And it's the same with the social chapter, it's the same with the single currency, and then with the their transitional controls on immigration. My view as I look back on it is that that opt-out culture was at the roots of Britain's problems from Europe, right at the beginning, right back to the 70s. Every Prime Minister, except Edward Heath himself, basically wants to opt out of whatever is the next thing that Europe does. And the great irony is that Tony, who, apart from Ted Heath himself, is probably our most naturally pro-European Prime Minister, opts out like the rest of them. As we said earlier, he opts out of the euro.
That was opting out the other way, though, wasn't it?
But nonetheless, the psychology of opt-out was important, because I was party to the discussions. And what people said at the time, some people inside the government, is, look, we should just go with the European mainstream on this. That it's not a good idea for us to try and jump the gun and seize an advantage. The reason why we opt out is that we think we're going to seize an advantage. It's rather like not going into the euro. We think we'll seize an advantage because we will become the main source of the most dynamic immigrants coming from Central and Eastern Europe. And of course, in a sense, that's true. That does happen. We've had amazing talent that's come into the country. But the price of having this very large number of immigrants coming, as you say, was to prepare the way for a really big backlash at the hands of a super talented politician, whatever you think of him, a super talented politician in Nigel Farage, who seizes on the immigration issue to turn what had been a minority cause, and indeed a slightly off-the-wall cause, full Brexit, fully leaving the European Union, into the dominant issue in the country by 2016.
So apart from that, what did he get wrong?
Well, the historians will debate to the end of time, Iraq, whether it was a fundamental mistake.
Apart from that and Iraq.
I don't think he obviously got anything else wrong at a high level. I mean, you can have disagreements about whether he could have done things somewhat differently, whether he could have been bolder on public service reform, which I would ideally like him to have been. There was, he made his famous speech about scars on his back, and as he tells me even now, the idea that he could have got even more public service reforms of the kind we were doing, academy schools, foundation hospitals, tuition fees, past the Labour Party is probably is probably a chimera.
PFI? I mean, OK, you can say that's...
PFI wasn't a fundamental mistake. No, PFI is basically...
If you look at the maths, it was.
It's not a fundamental mistake. It's a judgment call on whether or not it's a good idea when you're investing in public services to pay for a lot of the revenue costs at the same time as you're paying for the capital. It's a kind of technocratic thing. I myself would have done less PFI, but I don't see it as a fundamental.
It's different to that. Who was I talking to the other day? Well, I think I heard it. Well, I can't remember what. But our embassy in Berlin, which is apparently a fabulous building. I've never been there. You may have been. But that was done on PFI, apparently. And we're paying for the building until, I think actually fairly soon, it comes to an end. And then we have to buy it again at commercial property rates.
Look, I'm not justifying PFI. I myself wouldn't have done PFI, and I wasn't particularly in favour of it at the time, because it just seemed to me to be paying more expensively for things that you'd have to pay for. Anyway, however, in historians and the next generation will remember and visit the embassy in Berlin. They're not going to worry about how it was paid for. And the same with all those hospitals and schools, many of which were put through the PFI channel. But the thing that really matters in terms of legacy is that there's new infrastructure there.
Where do you rank him in the league table of the 55 prime ministers?
I rank him highly on what I think is the acid test of a prime minister, which is, did they leave the country better off than they found it? That is the acid test of the person who holds this office. There are plenty of those 55 who didn't. I mean, some of them catastrophically worse than they found it. Think of Neville Chamberlain, becomes prime minister in 1937, when the big issue people are confronting is the legacy of the abdication. And when he leaves in 2000, in 1940, the country is about to be invaded. In Tony Blair's case, the country is much wealthier. by the time he leaves than when he becomes Prime Minister. There's peace in Northern Ireland. What had been basically a 100-year civil war in Ireland has ended. Our international standing is definitely stronger in 2007 than it had been in 1997. Though our European policy isn't as effective as it might have been, we are very much at the centre of European politics in 2007. And maybe fatefully, the crash hasn't happened. That comes in 2008. So on that acid test, he ranks very highly. He incontrovertibly ranks highly as an election winner. I mean, there's only a handful of prime ministers, indeed only 2 in the post-war era, who've managed to win 3 elections.
3.
Margaret Thatcher.
Harold Wilson.
3 in a row.
Right.
Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, you're absolutely right that Harold Wilson wins. Actually, Harold Wilson wins 4 elections, 4 elections out of 5. So he's definitely at the top there on that score. And of course, only he and Margaret Thatcher have done 10 years. And he has quite a significant impact. So Margaret Thatcher has quite a significant impact on him there, because when I said to him he could do more than 10 years, I mean, Angela Merkel is going into her 16th year now as Chancellor of Germany, and I said to him then that he should stay and he could win a 4th election. He said to me, no, the lesson of Thatcher is that nobody can do this job for more than 10 years. It's quite interesting. His view is that she sort of went mad in her 11th year in Downing Street, and so it was important he left after 10 years. So he's clearly a front rank Prime Minister. Whether he's one of the greatest is an issue that will be judged.
Do you put him above Attlee?
In terms of the standing of the country is very high in 2007. In 1951, the standing of the country is arguably lower than it was in 1945. We're less of a world power by 1951 than we had been in 1945. However, the welfare state has been created, and so for Labour people, of course, the country's in a much stronger state in 51 than it had been in 45. I would put them on about a par if you look at the pluses and the minuses of Attlee and Blair. And my own judgment, though you may disagree on this because you're a great admirer of Margaret Thatcher, is that he's about on a par with Margaret Thatcher too. But when you're dealing with really front-rank prime ministers, and he's clearly in that category, you can argue the toss, and there's no right answer.
I think the thing with Tony Blair is he changed the political weather for the Labour Party. Margaret Thatcher changed the political weather for the country. I'm not sure whether you could say that Blair did that for the country.
Well, that depends upon how much store you put on peace in Northern Ireland and the reconstruction of the public services. My view is that the NHS in its current form, which is arguably the most important social institution in the country, might not have survived as a taxpayer-funded service if it weren't for 10 years of a Labour government which trebled NHS spending in real terms. And peace in Northern Ireland absolutely wasn't a done deal in 1997. And that has been, if you look at the problem of the British state, really, for most of the time which the office of Prime Minister has been in existence, the relationship between England and Ireland has been one of the most problematic issues.
I'm not trying to diminish that at all. I think that was an incredible achievement. All I'm saying is that I think in the 1980s, you had the complete transformation of the economy. You had privatisation. The unions were dealt with. Now, you're right in what you say about public services under Blair, but does that really rank in the same way?
I certainly don't think you could put Tony Blair at the very forefront of Prime Ministers without Northern Ireland. However, as I was saying, the relationship between England and Ireland is one of the most difficult issues which Prime Ministers have had to grapple with right back to Walpole in 1721. Indeed, I would say about half of all Prime Ministers, half of the 55 Prime Ministers in your podcast series, one of the biggest problems they've had to deal with is Ireland, if not the biggest problem. And Blair certainly ranks very highly in dealing with that.
You're absolutely right on that. And it's very interesting when you compare this book to the one that I'm now working on, The Presidents, where slavery is a running sore throughout virtually every president, almost up to the, well, you could say up to the current time.
Anyways, yeah,
you really could. And Ireland has the same effect among British prime ministers.
I mean, Gladstone, Ireland who's a great prime minister, Ireland overwhelms his premierships. Lloyd George is brought down essentially on Ireland, all of the stresses and strains of having to negotiate the independence of Southern Ireland, and it goes on. It's been a huge. William Pitt, the younger, his ministry essentially falls over Ireland in 1801. And the Act of Union and the inability to carry Catholic emancipation afterwards. It's been a huge running issue, and he's certainly great on that score. What's very amusing is that Tony's own regrets are remarkably few. As he looks back on his own 10 years. Freedom of information he doesn't like. And he thinks it was a mistake to abolish hunting.
Does he really?
He thinks because he thinks that cost him a lot of votes with provincial and rural England, which he had a big bond with. So when he looks back on his premiership, he certainly doesn't see the big flaws that many others do as they look back on it.
I wonder whether any Prime Minister does.
I think that's a very, very good question. And it's particularly an issue with wars. One of the things I've noticed working for a Prime Minister and observing others is that because the costs of wars are so great in human life, in the tragedy that's created, it's very, very hard to express regrets about wars that you fought, whatever you think. And I don't think that Tony will ever say anything other than he was right on Iraq, in the same way as LBJ, right to the end, said he had no choice on Vietnam. I think there are some places which prime ministers and holders of the supreme office in government, some places they simply can't go and they look back at their own legacies.
Good place to end. Andrew, thank you very much. Well, that's all for this edition of The Prime Ministers. Don't forget there'll be a total of 55 different podcasts for you to enjoy by the time the series is completed later this year. So do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from and leave a review. The Prime Ministers, edited by me, Ian Dale, is available in hardback at £25, published by Hodder & Stoughton as an ebook and as an audiobook. Join us again next time. Goodbye.